Good evening. I'm not a Cabinet Minister. My name is Paul Valentine, and I'm the Deputy Leader of Angus Council. Cabinet Secretaries, ladies and gentlemen, may I bid you a warm Angus welcome to the St Andrew's Church here in the Borough of Arbroath. We are pleased to welcome the Scottish Cabinet to our community in Angus, and how fitting it is that it is in the shadow of Arbroath Abbey. The Abbey is, of course, most famous for the Declaration of Arbroath, which was drafted on the 6th of April, 1320. And one of its most important statements is the notion that the King was elected by the nation, a constitutional monarchy. The reminder that public servants, no matter how high, are servants of the people. Cabinet Ministers, I think you will find that the residents of Angus are warm and welcoming, but have also kept this notion that elected members are servants of the people and that we answer to them. You're always welcome to visit Angus and to witness what the county has to offer. Please come back and see us again soon, because there are some exciting and innovative things happening here. But for the moment, welcome, and please enjoy your evening. I'd now like to hand over to Joe Fitzpatrick.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and good afternoon. And thanks very much to Councillor Valentine for that warm Arbroath welcome, and also to Reverend Martin Fair for allowing us to use this magnificent venue. My Cabinet colleagues and I are delighted to be here in Arbroath for the 8th and final in our series of Cabinet meetings to discuss our country's future. The referendum on the 18th of September is a choice between two futures. The First Minister and the Cabinet are determined to ensure that the people of Scotland have all the information you need to make your decision on the 18th of September. That's why the Cabinet have been holding meetings the length and breadth of Scotland to allow you the opportunity to pose your questions on our proposals for an independent Scotland. However, tonight the questions don't have to be just about independence. We're here to answer your questions on anything and all of the work of the Scottish Government. In a moment, you'll have the opportunity to hear from the First Minister, and we'll then open the floor for your questions for about an hour. Following the formal session, we hope you'll be able to join us for a cup of tea in the church hall, where the discussions can continue with individual Cabinet Ministers. So without any further ado, can I ask you to please welcome the First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, MSP.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to be here in St Andrew's Church in Arbroath. I've just been speaking to Martin, the Minister. He says he's going to insist on this build-up every Sunday. I think he should, actually, because this is a fantastic church to be holding a meeting in. I used to be a singer, you know. I was a boy soprano. And so I still look at buildings and I think, you know, what's it's all right, I'm not doing it tonight. I was a boy soprano, it was a wee while ago. But I still look at buildings, and this is a church with fantastic acoustics, and it couldn't be better in terms of holding a conversation and a meeting. This is the Scottish Cabinet's final public discussion before the referendum. It's our 8th discussion of the year, our 32nd one since 2008. In total, in that time, I'm told here, we've spoken to more than 5,000 people and answered approximately 1,300 questions. That means there was 3,700 folk who couldn't think of anything to ask. But I'm sure in Arbroath tonight, there'll be plenty of questions. It's maybe worth making a quick contrast. The last time we were in a church hall was Portleffen Parish Church Hall. A couple of months back. And you may remember it was in the same day as the UK Cabinet were having a Cabinet discussion. They were having, if I remember correctly, the third Cabinet meeting in history in Scotland. I'll just repeat that. They were having their third cabinet meeting in history in Scotland. We were having our 32nd touring round Scotland since 2008. And they had a cabinet meeting in the headquarters of Shell Oil in Dyson in Aberdeen. And they answered not a single question, met not a single person, apart from, of course, the top executives of Shell Oil. We were in Portleffen Church. And any member of the public, as any member of the public will tonight, would have a full and fair opportunity to ask their questions. I bring with me the entire cabinet. You see them arrayed before you. This is a tactical move on my part. You see, when we get to question time, if I'm asked difficult questions, then of course I have to delegate responsibility to one of the cabinet secretaries. And whereas if it's an easy question, then I'll take personal responsibility and step forward. So I want to say just a few words to begin with. Shona Robertson, where are you, Shona? There she are, the Commonwealth Game Minister. Didn't she do a fantastic job in running the Commonwealth Games? Well, one of the great things about having the cabinet out and about is we go around all the local clubs and initiatives and are able to make announcements. And it was with fantastic pleasure that Shona and I went to the Abbey Bowling Club today to make an announcement in the future of Bowls Scotland and a big investment in their coaching staff. But of course we met Darren Burnett, who won a fantastic gold medal in the singles in the Commonwealth Games for Arbroath and for Scotland. And provided a fantastic boost for this town, although Darren was keen to point out that he wasn't actually a member of the Abbey Bowling Club. He's a member of Arbroath Bowling Club. But it was still a gold medal for Arbroath, ladies and gentlemen. Give him a cheer. And the point about it is this, that if we are to take advantage of the huge surge in enthusiasm, and let me say, I actually thought that bowls was one of the fantastic successes of the Commonwealth Games, not just because Scotland won 3 gold medals, 4 medals in all, but just the backdrop of the bowls competition with Kelvin Grove in the background and Glasgow University and that just whole scene. I mean, I'm sure many people watching that around the planet would be astonished, surprised by that view. And I thought that was one of the greatest bowling venues I'd ever seen. But then I played, actually, today, my first ever game of bowls. I played my first ever game of bowls with Darren and the clubs in a foursome today. I put my first bowl right beside the jack. The first competitive bowl I've ever bowled in my puff, I put right beside the jack. And just to demonstrate that it was beginner's luck, I put my last one right into the pit at the back. Mind you, so did Darren, actually. I think they were trying to sell the game. But anyway, I thought that the Kelvin Grove was one of the greatest venues I'd ever seen. And then today I saw the Abbey Bowling Club in the shadow, in the lee of Arbroath Abbey. I doubt if there's anywhere more scenic for a bowling green or for any venue than that. And so what we do is, with people who've been inspired by the Commonwealth Games, is to make sure that enthusiasm can be channeled. And Arbroath, of course, is one of the sports hubs, 150 sports hubs that are growing up around Scotland, to make sure that the legacy of the Commonwealth Games provides the opportunity for people not necessarily to become gold medalists, but to participate, of all ages, in activities. And it's going to be a fantastic thing, bringing lasting benefits to communities. I also visited Northern Avenue, a development where 18 new council houses are being built in Arbroath. They're part of a £135 million programme the government established. They've put us, the point today was it takes us through the 4,000 mark for council housing, which we are pleased about. I think there's a lot more to do and a lot more to come, but we're pleased about 4,000 because the previous administration in Scotland managed 6. And they were all in Shetland, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen. Every single one of the 6 was in Shetland. So 4,000 is a start in providing not just vital accommodation and making sure that council housing is part of the range of housing accommodation that people are entitled to have, but providing a valuable investment. 8,000 jobs were supported by that council house building programme, the resumption of council house building in Scotland through some of the toughest economic times over the last few years. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Northern Avenue, the Community Sports Hub in Arbroath, are important local initiatives and opportunities. But I want to say something tonight about the national opportunity that awaits us in exactly 1 month's time. Earlier today, I took the chance to visit Arbroath Abbey after I did the Boland, where the famous decoration was written in 1320. One of the great questions, incidentally, we're in a church, so I shouldn't really talk about pub quizzes, I suppose, but if you're ever in a pub quiz of some kind or other, then ask somebody when the Declaration of Arbroath was signed. And the answer is, of course, it wasn't signed, ever. It was sealed in 1320. It may not have been sealed in Arbroath, but it certainly was written in Arbroath. And Bernard de Linton, who was the Chancellor of Scotland, the Abbot of Arbroath, John Swinney's counterpart in the early 14th century in Scotland, the Chancellor of Scotland, he composed these extraordinary words which have resonated through the centuries. And the most important thing about the many extraordinary concepts, and one of them, which is not well known, incidentally, you find a passage in the Declaration of Arbroath which says, in the eyes of God, all people are equal, Scots and English, Jews and Gentiles. You'll search very hard, incidentally, in medieval Europe to find a reference like that, particularly with regard to the Jewish people. It's something we should all be proud of. But one of the things in the Declaration which gave it its importance, it's the first ever European articulation of the concept of popular sovereignty. Basically, as part of the Declaration, once we get past the bit about 100 of us remaining alive, it says, look, you see this good King Robert that we want as our king? If he was ever to desert us, if he was to abandon the allegiance he's pledged to the community of the realm of Scotland, then we'll get rid of him and we'll get somebody else to defend our rights. The first ever articulation of the concept of popular sovereignty. That there's something important that lies beyond nobility, aristocracy, feudalism, the king or queen or whoever, and it's about the whole community of the realm. And it's a debt that has resonated through the centuries. It's a debt that the United States of America and their Senate recognized just a few years ago, that 460 years later, that concept of popular sovereignty was important in the formation of the United States of America. And the Declaration of Arbroath was important in the Declaration of Independence, because they, that time later, were looking for a justification, an authority, a moral authority for rebelling against a king. And they found it in the concept of popular sovereignty, which is at the heart of the Declaration of American Independence. So today, I want to make a declaration which is suitable for modern times. Not a declaration of 1320, but a declaration that recognizes that the Declaration of Arbroath was about the people of Scotland, the community of the realm, and make a declaration of opportunity for the people of Scotland. See, the opportunity that we're all about to engage in on September the 18th is not unique. Other countries in the world have had a democratic opportunity to vote for independence. But I tell you, it's very rare. It's very precious. It is very unusual. In the Commonwealth Games, there were 71 territories and countries came to compete in Glasgow. I was actually doing a business conference in the eve of the Commonwealth Games, and the BBC Radio 4 presenter was doing the business conference. He said, Alec, he said, look, I have to ask one question about the referendum. I know we're keeping politics out of the games, but one question about the referendum. So when it came to the question, John Humphreys said to me, he said in front of this audience of business people from around these 71 territories in the Commonwealth Games, he said, do you think this audience is anxious at all about the process of independence or the thought of independence for Scotland? And I looked at the audience from these 71 countries and territories around the Commonwealth. I said, I don't think so, John, since 56 of them come from countries which obtained their independence from Westminster. And over the years, I suppose, ladies and gentlemen, I've met the High Commissioners, the ambassadors, the Prime Ministers from every single one of these countries over the years. And one thing they have in common, rich and small, poor and blessed nations, nations with challenges, nations with opportunities. The one thing they all have in common, all shapes and sizes, is not one of them has ever said they intended to return to Westminster rule. Not one of them has ever said, listen, we're changing our minds. We're going to become un-independent. We're going to go back under Westminster rule. So this opportunity that we have, given that so many countries have had to fight for their independence, so many countries have had huge difficulties and striven for their independence. I remember the first free elections in South Africa where people queued, if you remember, for miles. Those of us in this audience tonight who are old enough to remember these shots, people queued for miles on end to have their first ever opportunity to vote in a ballot box. And this opportunity that we have as a consented process, a peaceful transition to independence is rare, unique, precious. It is the most enormous national opportunity. It may never come our way again, ladies and gentlemen. Because you see, the Westminster politicians who are running the No campaign are making it clear where power will reside in the event of a no vote. Westminster resents independent decision-making in Scotland. When the Scottish Parliament introduced free personal care some years ago under the First Ministership of Henry McLeish, and Henry had an idea about free personal care, he didn't see why it was right and proper that people had to sell their homes to afford personal and nursing care, and introduced the concept of free personal care. Then the Westminster government responded by cutting housing benefit, attendance allowance. Not quite sabotaging the project because Henry went ahead anyway, but nonetheless making it more difficult, challenging financially. Their argument was, since it was free, there was no need to have attendance allowance anymore. So the money in Social Security would have come to the people in attendance allowance, didn't come anymore, so the Scottish Parliament had to up the amount an allowance for free personal care, making it very economically challenging to do so. The government minister concerned was somebody called Alistair Darling. I can't remember what happened to him at all, but and then when the Scottish Parliament resisted the privatisation of the National Health Service, we were told it was anti-reform. And now it's been signalled that enough is enough. The current Scottish Secretary has made it clear that Westminster wants to reassert authority over Scotland. The Scottish Labour Party put forward proposals to devolve all income tax to Scotland. That was their proposal. That was shot down by the London Labour Party. The man most likely to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson. I know it sounds ridiculous, but nonetheless, most likely to be, in the bookies' odds, the next leader of the Conservative Party has said there is no need whatsoever for any extra powers for the Scottish Parliament. So a future in Westminster's hands, perhaps forever, is the likely outcome of a no vote in September. With a yes vote, we can take responsibility, we can shape our own future, we can put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands. Now, everybody agrees, more or less, now that Scotland is a country of immense resources and immense human talent. If we were independent last year, we'd be the 15th most prosperous country in the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Per capita, we'd be 15th. The UK is 19th. The countries above Scotland, with the exception of Australia, America and Germany, are all small Western European nations. Countries like Denmark, countries like Luxembourg, countries like Sweden and Finland. We have enormous strengths. Not just strengths in natural resources, although these are evident. We've got 5 universities in the world's top 200, more than any other country on the planet. We have 5 universities in Scotland in the world's top 200. We've got a range of strengths in our exports. Richard Lochhead, was Agricultural Secretary, was telling us today the latest estimates for exports of food and drink from Scotland were 14 billion last year, 14,000 million pounds, a dramatic rise over the last few years. Last year there were 13 billion, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen. I thought there might be a kind of theme there, 13, 14, Battle of Bannockburn. Nice and easy to remember. I thought, we're better than Arbroath to hear this news. You realise that if it had been 20 billion, it could have been 1320, declaration of Arbroath, Richard. So that's one of the great strengths of the Scottish opportunity. But, for lots of people, for lots and lots of people in Scotland, it doesn't feel like they're living in the 15th most prosperous country in the OECD, the Rich Countries Club. So today, I want to set out a declaration of opportunity. A declaration that's based on the vast potential of a talented people of this country, the vast potential that independence can release. A declaration that sets out 3 key opportunities from independence. First, the opportunity to protect our publicly owned, publicly run National Health Service forever from privatisation and the cuts that will result from privatisation. Secondly, the opportunity to create a fairer Scotland, ending the assault through austerity on the most vulnerable members of society. And thirdly, and to my mind, perhaps the most important opportunity of all, that's the opportunity for young people to stay in Scotland, if they so choose to build a future in their own country, as opposed to having to go elsewhere for opportunity and employment. And it's because of these opportunities, I think Scotland's future will be better in Scotland's hands. Now, the first opportunity is to protect our National Health Service, and we've been having this debate over the last week. It's probably been the most significant part of the independence debate over the last week. And the Unionist coalition, the Westminster parties, the Better Together, say, wait a minute. The health service, that's run in Scotland. How can you possibly say that independence is going to protect the health service from privatisation when the health service is already run in Scotland? Well, the answer is quite simple, ladies and gentlemen. It was Nye Bevan, the great politician who devised the National Health Service in the post-war settlement, great Welsh politician. And he once said that you don't need a crystal ball when you can read the book. And if we want to see what's going to happen without independence, without a change in our circumstances, if we want to see the pressure that's going to come down on the health service and other public services in Scotland as a result of privatisation and fragmentation and charging of the health service in England, we only have to look at the book of what's happening to the health service in Wales today. And we'll see in the Welsh Health Service today what will happen to Scotland tomorrow unless we change our circumstances. The Labour Party's health minister in Wales, that's the Labour Party's health minister, is a guy called Mark Drakeford. He is in absolutely no doubt as to the reason why the Labour Party in Wales, in administration, have found themselves cutting the health budget in real terms by 3% over the last few years. He says, quote, "The government at Westminster has an ideological view that the state is too big. By 2015, they have spent 5 years reducing it. If they are presented with another 5 years of doing that, the National Health Service in Wales will be a very different organisation from the one it is today." That is the Labour Health Minister in Wales. And let's for a second just assume, and I'm opposed to many of the Labour Party's personalities and some of their policies, but I don't believe for a second that the Labour Party, the administration of Wales, want to cut the National Health Service budget. I don't believe that for a second. I don't believe that Mr Mark Drakeford wants to be the health minister in a Labour administration in the National Assembly in Wales that cuts the National Health Service budget. So why has he ended up in that position? He's ended up in that position because Wales, like Scotland at the present moment, gets an allowance, gets a percentage of the spending in England. And if the spending in England is reduced as a result of the process of introducing charges to the National Health Service, already 10% of English health service expenditures going into the private sector, if that is the result of that process, then it cuts a percentage of the health service budget from Wales and from Scotland. That is what happens under the Barnett formula. And as that process escalates, and yesterday you may have seen the news, the new Jarrow Crusade, 500 people marching from Jarrow to London to protest against the privatisation and fragmentation of the English health service. That is what's happening. There's no doubt about it. Labour politicians, the unions are saying it day and daily south of the border. It will have an impact on Scotland if we stay in our current circumstances, and we'll find it progressively more difficult to keep a health service free at the point of need, the concept that Nye Bevan stood out for so many years ago. And the way to protect and to preserve our opportunity, our health service, our National Health Service, is to take control of Scotland's finances. So we are no longer affected, dependent on expenditure on the health service south of the border. But independence, allows us to go further. I'm sometimes asked, what are we going to do to capture this enthusiasm, this amazing outbreak of interest that we're seeing in politics? I was campaigning in Northfield in Aberdeen, a few weeks ago. And I was campaigning one side of the street, and a 16-year-old girl ran out of her house on the other side of the street in her pyjamas to demand to know if she was on the voters' roll. I wasn't even canvassing her house. And I've been talking about politics for 25 years. I can honestly promise you that no teenager, pyjamas or no, has never run out of her house before to demand to know if they're on the voters' roll. There is something extraordinary, something special, something amazing that's happening in Scotland as we speak. There's something extraordinary happening. And I'm sometimes asked, how can we bottle that enthusiasm? How can we make sure that after the referendum, that enthusiasm is maintained and sustained, that participation, which I think will drive an 80% poll in 1 month's time? I think my best answer is this. I think the thing that will do it is the creation of a new constitution. All these countries in the Commonwealth, every single one of them has a written constitution, with the exception of New Zealand, which has a basic law, which is roughly the same thing. Every other country in the European Union has a written constitution. The UK is virtually the only country, certainly the only developed country in the world, which doesn't have a written constitution guaranteeing the liberties of its citizens. Scotland will have, and we'll have a constitutional convention which will involve all the people, and through the wonders of modern media, a dramatic involvement of all the people in forming that constitution. But modern constitutions are not just about protecting essential liberties, although they are. They're also about guaranteeing essential rights. And one of the rights that I would propose, and it's only a proposal from one party, but nonetheless will be considered by the convention, the Constitutional Convention, is to enshrine the right to a public free health service at the point of need, which is part of the formation now of our identity as a country. So we can protect, we can preserve from financial pressure and from constitutional pressure the right to a national health service enshrined in the Constitution of a new Scotland. And enshrining and developing that Constitution, I think, will sustain the great public involvement that we're seeing in this process. Second opportunity is to end the assault that's taking place on some of the poorest people and most vulnerable in our community. The Westminster Government believes that the welfare reforms, as they call it, are popular. And of course, if you couch them in a certain way, they can be seen as popular. If I say to you, do we want folk to work? You'll all say yes. We'd all say yes. But if you do it another way, of course, it becomes an entirely different story. If you say, do you want to have a bedroom tax, which 80% of the people affected have a disability, then most folk in this church hall will say, no, we don't want that. Most people in this church hall, if you say, do you want to live in a country where there's been a fourfold growth in food banks in the last year, where up to 30,000 children are now in families depending on food banks for the basic necessities of life, do you want to live in that sort of country? Say no. Every single one of us, of course, admires the solidarity, the compassion, the spirit that people show in terms of food banks. We support them as a government. But do we really want to live in a society where food banks have become the norm? Back in November, the Angus Food Bank took control of 2 additional properties in Forfar. Derek Marshall, the chairman of the food bank, was quoted as saying, and Derek put it exactly right, "This is not success because we're growing. This is an indictment of society. The only time we'll be successful as a food bank is when our doors are closed." Does everybody think that? No. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the website, or a capture from the website of Better Together Aberdeenshire. You won't find it there now. They've taken it down for very obvious reasons. This is what they say, quote, "Food banks are Scotland becoming a normal European country. Many of them are run by churches. They provide a practical way for people to help those less fortunate than themselves." Now, the second bit of that is true, but the first bit isn't. Food banks are not part of being a normal country. And in this 15th most prosperous country in the OECD, the Rich Countries Club, I represent now one of Scotland's richer constituencies. I used to represent a constituency in Banff-and-Buchan which had substantial areas of poverty and deprivation, and I moved to the east in the Scottish Parliament, and in that constituency I've got Inverurie, which is one of the most prosperous towns in Scotland. Virtually full employment. Certainly full employment, actually. Doesn't mean there aren't poor people in Inverurie, of course there are. But nonetheless, it's a very, very prosperous town. In that prosperous town, one of the most prosperous towns in Scotland, with the highest property prices just about in the whole of Scotland. In that prosperous town, in this 15th most prosperous country in the OECD, there is a food bank. How can we arrive at a situation where we allow this to happen? And how can we arrive at a situation where we're told this is part of the process of becoming a normal European country? This is the 21st century. And it's our responsibility, not just to mitigate the bedroom tax, but to sweep away the logic that says you court easy popularity by targeting the most vulnerable in society. Second opportunity, to take responsibility, not just for having a rich country, but for having a decent society. And thirdly, and most crucially, I think the responsibility of every adult Scot to ensure that there are proper opportunities for the next generation. In the debate that we've had in the referendum, the Better Together forces, the Unionist parties say, look, we've been looking at the demographics, the future population profile of Scotland, and we calculate by the 2030s, Scotland will have too few working people and too many old people. Now, it's not the case at the present moment because we actually pay less of our wealth in terms of social benefits, in terms of pensions, than the UK as a whole. But certainly it's true, if you look at the demographics, then Scotland, in common with just about every Western European society, has a demographic challenge to overcome. And basically, if we want to stay ahead of the game, if we want to maintain our position, if we want to be able to pay our pensions comfortably in the future, then we've got to have net migration into Scotland of 24,000 a year. Now, if I was asked to give one condemnation of Westminster rule in Scotland, one statistic which summed up the failures through the century of Westminster rule in Scotland, it would be this: that in the years between 1901 and 2001, the population growth in Scotland was just over 10%. Over the same period, England's population grew by 60%. And our 10% was not a sign of economic success, it was a sign of economic failure and economic mismanagement. Our problem was not immigration, our problem was emigration. Now, since the Scottish Parliament arrived, things have been substantially reversed. In the years since the Scottish Parliament, then that position has dramatically changed. All the forecasts, which were for a declining population in Scotland, have been totally obliterated. We now have a rising population. The latest estimates for last year show Scottish population at the highest of all time. And we've managed to get 22,000 average since 1999 of net migration into the country. And I made this point several weeks ago in saying how important it was that we raised that to 24,000 to meet that demographic challenge. And the Herald newspaper, a perfectly respectable, responsible newspaper, ran a headline: Salmond sets 24,000 target for immigration. And I thought, that's very interesting, because I wasn't actually talking about immigration. I was talking about net migration. And it was particularly interesting because the editor of the Herald is a guy called Magnus Llewellyn, a very nice guy. So I phoned up Magnus and I said, look, Magnus came here a few years ago. I said, you do realise that you personally, you editor of the Herald, are one of these 24,000 immigrants that you're talking about. You do realise that, Magnus. And furthermore, the guy who wrote the story, another Magnus, who also came to Scotland just a few years ago, he was also another one of these, quote, immigrants that they were talking about. And Magnus Llewellyn, he sort of said, yeah, I see what you mean. So he gave me an article to explain it in more detail. So let me explain it to this audience tonight. Net migration is the balance between the people who come into the country and the people who leave the country. And each and every year, 70,000 people leave Scotland. Half of these are young people between the ages of 16 and 35. There's not a family in this hall, there's not a family in Scotland who don't know this, because each and every one of us have people who've been in that position. I'm sometimes told that independence is going to separate families from each other, which is a total nonsense, because the social union between Scotland and England, Scotland and Ireland, Scotland and Wales, Scotland and everywhere else won't be broken, it'll be maintained. But what could be more of a separation of families than arriving at a situation where young people in search of career opportunity leave their country in order to find fulfilling work. Because that is what's happening to Scotland still today and has happened to Scotland for many, many years. Last week, we announced that we were at an all-time high, a record, 26,590 young Scots had got acceptances for university or college. Fantastic. 26,590. An all-time record, up by over 1,000, 4% from the previous year. An all-time record. All of these 26,590 youngsters going into university, going into college this year, full of hope and expectation and opportunity. How many of them, after they graduate, will be able to work in Scotland? How many will leave? Will it be 30%, 40%, perhaps even 50%? Now, don't get me wrong. If someone wants to travel the world, I'm all for it. If that's what they want to do, this is the 21st century. It's one of the joys of the 21st century. If people want to travel and go for Scotland, great. That's not what I don't like. What I don't like is where people have no choice, effectively, in terms of finding a career which meets the talents. I also don't like the idea that a country can invest so much for so long in building up the human capital and talents of its people and then export them, effectively, through economic migration, export them out of the country. So when I hear Westminster politicians tell us we've got a demographic challenge, I say, yeah, we've got a demographic challenge, so why don't we do something about it? Why don't we allow some of the bright, wonderful students that we educate from overseas who come to Scotland to work in our country? Why don't we do that? That's what they want to do. And why don't we provide the job and life opportunities for our own youngsters to stay in the country if that's what they want to do? Why don't we do that as an answer to the demographic challenge? And there is no adult Scot who should duck their responsibility to that next generation and that declaration of opportunity which I'm making tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate, this conclusion we're coming to in this debate, the Arbroath Declaration all these years ago, it didn't simply help to ensure Scotland's survival as an independent nation. It said, as I mentioned earlier, that the wider community of Scotland could choose a government to protect her interests. It started that concept and embryo of popular sovereignty, which has had probably the most powerful, the most lasting influence on the planet. But of course, when you think about it, we've never really had true popular sovereignty in Scotland. In 1707, the last thing that was done was to put a decision to the vote. In 1707, when the Union was passed 307 years ago, it wasn't passed by popular assent. On the contrary, as far as you can judge, it was fiercely, dramatically unpopular. And for far, far too long, and for far too many people, Scotland's history has been a tale of things which have been decided for us. It's why, for example, post-war deindustrialisation had such devastating consequences for so many communities. And even now, after 15 years of improvement, and despite all of Scotland's wealth and potential, we're still being affected by policies that don't match our values or our needs. They're driven by priorities we don't share and implemented by governments we don't elect. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm 59 years old. I can hear you all sitting there where the pews used to be and saying, "My, you don't look it." I can hear you all saying that. For more than half of my life, ladies and gentlemen, Scotland has been governed from Westminster by governments we have not elected. For more than half of my life. That is a democratic deficiency which is no longer acceptable. And that's why the chance we've got in 1 month's time is the opportunity of a lifetime. See, on the 18th of September, every single one of us can go into a polling station, or before then, have our postal vote on the kitchen table. And each one of us in that situation will take the future of this country into our hands. And it's not a decision that will be dictated by me or even these estimable cabinet ministers. It won't be dictated by the media or the politicians or the press, by the campaign groups or by the coalition government or by the elites of London or by Edinburgh, for that matter. Every single one of us on that day will be equal before the ballot box. True popular sovereignty will come to Scotland. It will be our moment and our time. And at that moment of decision, in 1 month's time, the question that people will have to consider is, having arrived at that decision, do we actually want to hand the sovereignty back again? Or should we take the powers we need to create a more prosperous country, face up to our responsibility to create a more just society? That's the choice, the opportunity that this country faces on the 18th September. And once we seize it, as seize it we will, from that moment on, Scotland's future will be in Scotland's hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, First Minister. We'll now move to the formal question and answer session. We've got a slight technological problem, so I think we're going to have to share the one microphone. Shall
Why are you passing it to me?
So on the stage today then, we have Alec Neil, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing, Angela Constance, Cabinet Secretary for Training, Youth and Women's Employment, First Minister, Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Culture, and John Swinney, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Sustainable Growth. At the back, we have Keith Brown, Minister for Transport and Veterans, Richard Lockhead, Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Food and the Environment, Shona Robertson, as First Minister introduced earlier, Cabinet Secretary for Commonwealth Games, Sport, Equalities and Pensioners' Rights, Kenny McCaskill, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, and Aileen Campbell, the Minister for Children and Young People. I'm going to take questions in batches of 3 and then invite the First Minister and other members of the Cabinet to respond. We've also got a few questions from Twitter, which I'll try to feed in as the night goes on. I'll try to take a few of them. Now, we normally have more questions than we have time for, and we have more people in the audience today than we've had at other events. So if you do have a question, I would urge you to get your hand up early. I'd also ask people to try and keep their questions as short and sharp as possible, and I'm sure Cabinet colleagues will keep their answers concise. If you don't manage to get to your question, don't worry. There's forms on all the chairs. You can write your question down and put it in the box at the back, and every question will receive an answer. So we could make a start. I'll select people if you raise your hand, and if you wait until the microphone comes to you, and then if you then say your name. So take the gentleman over there in blue. Yep. And the young man just here. And yep, somebody up in the balcony there. Yep.
Hi. It's a question to Mr. Salmond. In the event of us getting independence, do you think there might be a rise in taxes in the transition period from when we go on for the first year or two? That's all.
Okay. Just here? No, it's here. Yep.
Hi, I'm Robbie Nicholl, Member of Scottish Youth Parliament for Angus North and Mearns. My question is, are there any plans to continue the fantastic engagement of young people in politics by firstly introducing more political education into schools and also by lowering the voting age?
Okay, and then the gentleman. Is there a microphone in the back? The gentleman in the balcony. Is there a microphone in the balcony? That's just coming, right, sorry.
It's on its way.
Of course, we've got one of the microphones down here. Yeah.
Exactly how much is it going to cost for independence?
How much will it cost?
Right. On the first question, if the gentleman allow me, I've got the Finance Secretary here, so I'm going to pass that to him. We've got the youth question, which I'm going to pass to Aileen, who is the youngest member of the Cabinet and ministerial team here, expecting a baby, ladies and gentlemen, which is she's very excited about. And then the third one, I'm going to answer myself. That's the cost of independence. So if I can do it that way, John first, then Aileen, then me.
On the gentleman's question about taxes, there is absolutely no need for taxes to rise for Scotland to become independent. If you look at the Government Expenditure and Revenue in Scotland report over the last 5 years, what it shows you is that the public finances of Scotland on a like-for-like basis with the UK were essentially £8.3 billion stronger than the finances of the United Kingdom. So Scotland is a country that pays our way, that can afford the public services that we rely upon. Obviously, what opens up for Scotland with independence is the ability to change policy, to improve the strength of our public finances, and we as a government believe that it is wrong to focus on the endless austerity of the UK agenda, that instead we should take a different decision about investing in our public services and in our economy. We would deliver not the 1% increase in public finances, which is proposed by the UK, but a 3% increase in the public finances, which would enable us to strengthen the investment in the economy, to generate a higher level of economic activity, and as a consequence to strengthen our public finances, which opens up to us in the long run the ability to use the resources and the wealth of Scotland to the advantage of Scotland. So the very direct answer to your question is that there is no need for taxes to rise for Scotland to become independent.
Thank you. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to continue the enthusiasm that young people particularly have had over the constitutional debate over the last 2 years, and I think there's also opportunity as well, the Curriculum for Excellence as well, to harness that enthusiasm beyond the referendum campaign. But I think as well, along with the Scottish Youth Parliament, Young Scot, all these fantastic organisations that we have right across Scotland who are engaging, mobilising young people, making sure they've got registered to the vote, people running out to see the First Minister in their jammies as well, making sure that they are on the voters register is a great sign that young people in particular are motivated about the decision that is ahead of us in Scotland. And I think as well, the other thing that we need to do then is to continue that motivation, continue that enthusiasm by making sure young people's voices are heard in the drafting of the written constitution. So what a wonderful opportunity for young people to make sure that you can shape the type of country that we want all to live in. You are, Scotland's future. The white paper is called Scotland's future. You've got the biggest stake in what that country will look like. So you absolutely have to make sure that you are part and parcel of that debate and that discussion that will ensue after a yes vote in September. And in terms of the voting age, well, this is the first time we've had competency to extend the franchise. We've done it in very small ways in the past, with the Crofters Commission and for the direct election to health boards in the Dumfries and Galloway and in the Fife. But I think, as a party, the SNP have always had as a policy that we wanted to lower the voting age because there are young people who are 16, 17 paying taxes in Scotland, working hard in Scotland, but not having a say in how those taxes are spent. So I think, there's considerable merit in looking at that beyond independence, and it's something that other parties are playing catch-up on. So I think there's a great deal of consensus. But in terms of young people, I think the written constitution is a phenomenal opportunity for young people to be involved in.
In terms of cost of independence, then, if by that the gentleman means the set-up costs of independence, then there's an estimate from a professor at the London School of Economics called Patrick Dunleavy of £200 million, which I wouldn't demur from. The estimate came about, incidentally, because the Treasury published a suggestion which they said was based on Patrick Dunleavy's work, that would cost £2.8 billion, and that we were proposing to set up 70 government departments in Scotland. Unfortunately for the Treasury, Professor Dunleavy got rather annoyed at what he called the traducing of his work. He said they'd inflated his estimates by a factor of 12. Indeed, he called the Treasury work a dodgy dossier. And the Treasury Permanent Secretary has had to admit that it's been a misbriefing of the professor's work. So I think Dunleavy, who works on structures of government, has made an estimate which I think is very reasonable. But he's also said, of course, if you do things more efficiently, then whatever the initial startup cost, you'll quickly recoup it. And we've actually got a splendid example of that in the last year or two in Scotland. We had devolved to a stamp duty starting next year. And we decided to have a different, fairer type of tax to replace it. And so we put it out to tender as to who should collect this new tax. Should it be HMRC or should it be a new Revenue Scotland? And in that Revenue Scotland, there were set-up costs. But the costs of the tender were 25% cheaper than having it administered by HMRC. And as a result, after 3 years, and then for every year thereafter, we recouped the establishment costs of setting up Revenue Scotland. Now, you may say it wouldn't be difficult to do things more efficiently than HMRC. In fact, each and every one of us has probably splendid examples, and there are many legion stories. And I think that's right. And if you look around the world, the efficiency of, for example, collecting taxation is much higher in many, many other countries than it is in the UK at the present moment. And I think that'll be one of the great bonuses. The other thing to remember is this, that for all the UK departments, we currently administer 60% of public spending in Scotland. When we're independent, we'll administer 100% of it. But if you look at these other 40%, yes, there'll be some administration costs in setting up some of the systems for these departments. But there's many, many opportunities to do things more efficiently. Some of the administration of these other departments is already in Scotland. For example, every single public pension paid in Scotland comes from either Dundee or Motherwell in the payment centres. Indeed, many of the public pensions paid across England comes from Dundee or Motherwell. So in some places, the administration's in place. And in the other departments, then the set-up costs, which Dunleavy estimated at 200 million, will quickly be overtaken by running things better and more efficiently. And the final thing, since Mr. Swinney is not going to demur from this, I gave that example of what's happening in Wales with the health service. And if I had to give one reason why we've managed to maintain health service spending in real terms in Scotland against an overall 6% reduction in our budget from Westminster in real terms, then it would actually be two words. The answer would be John Swinney. This is the only finance secretary in Europe who has managed to run a balanced budget over these last 7 years.
Okay. The lady there, yep. Lady here, and the gentleman over there with a striped shirt. Yeah. So is it in the middle there? Yep. Yeah, go.
Hello. I know there's not going to be a change in the tax, but is there going to be a change in the national insurance contributions?
Okay. And then here.
Hi. You want more migrants into the country? Well, will you vet them? We've already had murderers, thieves, rapists in. Will they be vetted, or will they just be allowed to march in?
Okay, and then the gentleman here, yeah.
Thank you, First Minister, and thank you, Cabinet. My question tonight is, yes, Scotland's future, but Arbroath's future as well, and the future of the military here. We have Keith Brown here, who's an ex-4-5 commando military man, and at a meeting just a few weeks ago at Condor, the new CEO did say that the Army, Sphinx Battery, are leaving next August. That's deeply alarming for the people of Arbroath, because that's the economy of Arbroath. But not only that, the CEO then added in front of the SNP Provost that after the 18th of September, there may be no more 4-5 commando. So can this Cabinet give a declaration that after 70 years of Condor, HMS Condor and Condor, there is going to be a military base here, a declaration that it is going to stay and the economy of Arbroath will remain the same? Thank you.
Okay. 1 minute. 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 1 minute
Well, as you rightly say, we have our Veterans Minister, Keith Brown, who served in the Armed Forces and therefore is best placed to answer that question. I'm going to get John to answer the national insurance, and then I'll address the lady's question in the front row. Keith?
Thanks very much. I should say it's some time since I was stationed in Arbroath at 4-5 Commando. It's changed quite a bit in the meantime. But right throughout that period, the future of 4-5 Commando, in fact, the entire Corps of Royal Marines has been in some doubt. You may remember in the 1980s, certainly when I was there, Margaret Thatcher wanted to abolish the entire Corps of Royal Marines. And really, that's been the history. We're now down to around 11,000 Armed Forces personnel in Scotland. Not quite an all-time low, but it's very low. And we've taken a disproportionate share of those cuts here in Scotland. We've advocated the retention of 4-5 Commando for some of the reasons that you've mentioned previously. But it's also our position that we would retain the bases that we currently have in Scotland and seek to increase the armed forces. 11,000 is too small, in our view, for the needs of an independent Scotland. We believe we should have around 15,000 armed forces personnel, with 5,000 reserves on top of that. And not only that, if you think about the Marines in particular, our real need is to have an increased maritime presence. There is not a single, has not been for many years, a single major Navy surface vessel in Scotland. The UK has stopped doing the air patrols over the northeast of Scotland, taking on Russian incursions and so on. We don't have the defence that we need just now, and what we're going to get instead, if we have a no vote, is over £100 billion being spent on a Trident submarine system that even the senior forces personnel don't want to have. I know my ex-colleagues in 4-5 Commando have served in Afghanistan and have not had the helicopter support they need, have not had the personal equipment they need. Some of their colleagues have been handed their P45 whilst they're on active service in Afghanistan. So what we've said is there will be no compulsory redundancies for the armed forces in independent Scotland. If you make that extraordinary commitment to join the armed forces, you should have an extraordinary commitment back, which should mean, whilst you're in active service, while you're committed to a contract, the government should not end that contract. And it's not just, of course, the individuals, it's their families, as you'll know well enough here in Arbroath as well, who are affected by this. So what I see is an expanding role for the armed forces in independent Scotland, one which looks after the things we need looked after, our coastline, our oil rigs, and the things around the coastline which have to be protected, for example, from drugs and other things. And those things are not being done just now, so there's more than enough room to keep the bases that we already have and to increase the armed forces personnel in Scotland.
I think I heard the lady's question correctly about any proposed increases in national insurance contributions. There is certainly no proposal in the white paper for us to do so. In my answer to the gentleman a moment ago, I made clear that Scotland already generates sufficient tax revenues to pay for the public services, all of the public services, both the 60% of public expenditure that I control, the 40% that's controlled by the UK government. We currently generate sufficient resources to put us in a stronger financial position to the rest of the United Kingdom. So there are no proposed increases in national insurance contributions either.
In answer to the lady's question, we propose a point-based immigration system where people qualify for immigration through skills, abilities they have. I've made the point about students who I think have got a fantastic role to play in this country, particularly in answering the demographic challenge. But you were asking particularly about the law. So we've got the Justice Secretary here, and I asked Kenny McCaskill to say a word about the law and criminality and where we are in Scotland.
Well, we're looking to improve on the information that we have. Scotland actually has remarkably good information systems, and even this morning, you might have seen on TV, I was announcing Clare's Law pilot in Aberdeen and Ayrshire, built upon what's happening south of the border, what we've seen in Mark's Law, where people who have reason to suspect that somebody may have a conviction for sexual offences, they can find that out from the police. This is about those who may seek to inveigle themselves into a relationship, to come into somebody's home, and to make sure that they have the right to find out about that. These checks and balances have not simply to be for our own people, they most certainly have to be for those who would seek to come here and make this their home. And therefore I can give you the clear commitment that we are intent on improving the information, the checks that we have, and equally that these will apply to those who come here as well as those who reside here.
Okay, I'll start this set of questions with a Twitter question. This one from As Told by Angus, and they ask, will we still get Radio 4? Then take the gentleman here and the lady here.
Good evening. My name's Kevin Hutchins. I did come along actually to ask a question about Condor. I've read the white paper and I couldn't actually see a mention about the valuable role of Condor or indeed the valuable role of the Royal Marines. And I would have said that not only do they have a valuable role in terms of fishery protection, but also in terms of international peacemaking and peacekeeping. And could I also perhaps ask a further question? On the issue of lethal highs, I noticed in the white paper it suggested that that should be dealt with just at a Scottish level. Surely it's a United Kingdom issue because the borders are porous and legal highs should be dealt with wherever they actually are an issue in the United Kingdom today.
Hi, my name is Aileen McNichol. I don't actually have a question, if I may make a comment. I'm not quite as old as the First Minister, but I'm delving into my 50s very soon, and never have I been so excited about politics as I am right now. Those on my Facebook page will definitely know. But I would actually like to take this opportunity to thank the SNP for actually getting us here to make this decision on the 18th of September. There's such a lot of negativity in the media about all sorts of things, and no praise has ever been given for actually allowing the Scottish population to place their vote. So thank you very much.
The Twitter question interested me because presumably if he's tweeting in, he must know he can listen to Radio 4 on his computer. So I'm kind of fascinated by the question. But our proposal was we'll have a Scottish broadcasting service, a public broadcasting service, and we'll also have access to all of the BBC's output for a federated arrangement. Why would we get that? Well, because, firstly, the BBC is not interested in reducing its audience, but secondly, we're entitled to a proportionate share of BBC assets as all public assets. And what we propose to do is negotiate a proper federated relationship, as well as having a proper public service broadcasting operation in Scotland, so as we can have our window on the world, and the world can have its window on Scotland. But you can assure, tweet back now. Say that. Say yes. Okay. Yes. Now, I'm going to go to Keith again about the military, and also to Kenny about legal highs. But if I could just answer the comment and thank the lady, not just for the comment you made, but also for that fantastic phrase, which I am now going to use at the age of 59, that I am now delving into my 50s. So in future, I will not say to any audience around Scotland, I am 59 years old. I shall look at everybody and say, I'm delving into my 50s. So thank you so much for that wonderful remark.
Can I thank Mr Hutchings for his question? He's quite right to say, of course, fishery protection, Coast Guard protection, where we've seen substantial cutbacks in recent years, are crying out for additional resource. And you're right about the Marines as well. I mean, they're very motile, by land, by sea. They're very versatile, very able to adapt to different circumstances. And your point about international activity, I think, is very important. It's not in the white paper, but it's certainly my view that this government's committed to an independent Scotland being part of NATO. And if you're part of NATO, you have to give something to NATO. Now, if you think about some of the expertise there's in the Royal Marines, especially in relation to the SBS and anti-piracy, which, there's an awful lot of resource being required for that. I'm sure we could develop an expertise in that if required by NATO. But the Marines are exactly the kind of resourceful, versatile, adaptable troops that we should be using in independent Scotland. And just to say, one reason why it's hard to pin this down just now is because as recently as the last few months, with the UK's defence review, we didn't know whether 4-5 Commando were going to be there. Most people assumed, in fact, they said they would take them down south with the other two commandos. But I'm sure they're a very capable resource, along with 4-3 Commando, which you'll know is based at Faslane in terms of protection of the installations there. There is great resource there, and we want to make sure that Scotland's an attractive as place as possible. I've mentioned also the compulsory redundancies, and I think that will be attractive to Armed Forces personnel. And what you're seeing, the last time I was in 4-5 seeing the commanding officer, he was talking about the number of young men going off to the North Sea and wanting to leave the forces because they were forced to do 3 and 4 tours of Afghanistan. It wasn't the tours, it was the 6 or 7 months training away from their families before every tour that was producing a huge toll on them. So I think if you look after armed forces, we give an attractive proposition, then I think you'll see a great many Marines wanting to join the armed forces of an independent Scotland.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you asked about legal highs because actually earlier today I had a briefing from the police. Some of them were in the hall earlier. I went to meet with them. It's an issue that I know affects all of the country, but there's been particular issues here in Arbroath with shops. It's been raised by the local MSP Graham Day because of the problems. And I know in my own constituency of a young man just last year who died. I think, first of all, that part of the problem we initially see is the name. Legal highs, they're actually new psychoactive substances. When you put out legal highs, it gives the impression, especially to young people, that it's just a kind of glorified sherbet drab, that if it's legal, it must be safe. Legal doesn't equate safe. We are seeing far too many young people dying from taking sometimes what is horse tranquilizer, sometimes is something else. Now, obviously, the Misuse of Drugs Act is currently reserved to Westminster. Both my current Deputy, Rosanna Cunningham, and before that, Fergus Ewing, have worked very closely with the Home Office. We've got no complaints to make about how they've been addressing matters. It's very difficult. People change a slight compound, and what was illegal suddenly becomes legal. Part of this, as I say, I pay tribute to what the police have done here. I think they've been very proactive. At the instigation of Graham and others, they've been, frankly, taking the appropriate action that we welcome as a government. There's always more that has to be done, but it's not simply a north-south issue. This is a global issue. A lot of the imported drugs that they are coming in from the Far East or elsewhere. So what we want is to be able to do our own distinctive thing, which is why we support the police here, and I very much welcome the action that the Commander has taken to work with law enforcement agencies south of the border. But equally, I've been to visit Europol and indeed Interpol, because this is, as I say, a global issue. It can't all be solved by legislation and by law enforcement. Some of this is about raising awareness, which comes back to moving the terminology away from the legal high that sounds so benign and moving it on to a new psychoactive substance that every weekend, tragically, we're seeing a youngster lose their life.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 from down here and 1 up there. So the lady right at the back and the gentleman there with the striped top, just, yep. And then somebody up the stairs. Sorry, yep, gentleman up the stairs.
Hi, you talked about how there's more people going into education, universities and colleges, but the colleges have actually went through a very dramatic change this past 6 months. That's due to funding issues. Will we see that change?
Hello, my name is David Clark. I've actually been an SNP voter for 47 years. Now, my question is actually for any no voters. How do they feel if they were working for a week, getting their wages and giving their money to their neighbour, and then their neighbour giving them a certain amount back, which is a pittance normally? Would they be very happy about that? And not only that, if they work overtime, they still get the same, and they don't get any extra for working overtime. Would they be happy with that? In other words, what Westminster says to us, is that's what we've told you you're getting allowed to live off. Okay. I'd like an answer from that.
Okay, and the gentleman right at the back.
My question is about keeping the pound as Scotland's currency. Will the Bank of England have any say over our currency after independence? And why do we not have our own currency after independence? And I'd like to ask Mr. Salmond if he thinks he'll get a word in next time he meets Alistair Darling.
Well, the answer to that one is yes. I think it's quite important that as we approach this, that we don't berate people who haven't made up their minds in terms of independence yet. I think there is a substantial section of the community who have still to make up their minds. And I don't think the opinion polls are catching this. They're saying it's 10, 15%, not in my experience. In my experience, it's much, much more substantial than that. It's people who are actually, in the most part, I'm not saying everybody in that situation, are looking for a reason to vote yes. And I don't think you can do that, by tub thumping or waving your hands about or just saying that's it. I think you've got to do it by conversation, by persuasion, by the sort of meeting we're having tonight. In terms of the first question, I'm going to come on to pound in a second. But the question for the chap in the balcony about it's like giving your next door neighbour your pay packet and then taking an allowance back again. When I was a lad in Lithgow, my next door neighbour was a wonderful lady called Nan Bothwick, and that was one of her two reasons why she supported Scottish independence. She said exactly what that gentleman has said to me. She said, I wouldn't give she was a remarkable woman. She brought up 6 kids as a war widow. And she always said, I would never, ever give my housekeeping money to my next door neighbour. I love my next door neighbour. That was my mum, incidentally. So I've every respect for your mum, Alec, but I would never give your mum my housekeeping money and tell her to manage it. That's what I do. And I think that's a very sensible point. I thought it was a sensible point when I was a lad, and I think it's still a sensible point, today. And the second point she always made to me, incidentally, was she said, when Scotland becomes independent, England will lose a surly lodger and gain a good neighbour. And I thought that was the most terrific expression of the articulation of the point about taking the responsibility to be independent. So on the point about the currency, there are a number of currency options for an independent Scotland. We could join the euro, 17 countries in the euro. We don't think that's a good idea because the euro has got certain strains within it. Not so much between the countries in the north of Europe, but certainly between Germany and Greece, for example, because German productivity is about 60% higher than Greek productivity. We could do that, but we don't propose that. We could have a flexible exchange rate. Lots and lots of countries in the world have a flexible exchange rate. We could have a fixed exchange rate. Many countries in the world have a fixed exchange rate. Some of the most successful, Hong Kong, for example, spent generations with a fixed exchange rate to sterling, and then it switched to a fixed exchange rate to the dollar about 30, 40 years ago. And as we know, Hong Kong has prospered and flourished. All that's entirely possible. One of the things that's been clarified in the debate just over the last week or so is that they can't stop us using the pound. The pound is an internationally tradable currency. It's not in the gift of the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Governor of the Bank of England. The sterling can be used. It is our currency, I mean, I could even go further and point out that it was a Scot who founded the Bank of England. But that's not really what they're saying. What they're saying is not that you can't use the pound. They say that, but that's not what they mean, because they know they can't stop us using the pound. For example, take this, which I hope I've got in my pocket. There we go. I got a Robert the Bruce, not usually because I usually deal in £20 notes, but because I thought, given I'm here at Arbroath, Robert the Bruce was appropriate. Here's a Clydesdale Bank £20 note. That £20 note is backed by a balance that the Clydesdale Bank holds at the Bank of England on a one-to-one basis. So if we wanted to do that in an independent Scotland, all you'd have to do is transfer these balances to the Scottish Monetary Authority and the note would stay the same. It's backed by a sterling note. Well, I'm not saying it would solve the London taxi driver's problem. Nobody on earth can solve the London taxi driver's problem. But I'm just saying that that's backed one-to-one at the Bank of England. So yes, you could do that. Incidentally, I'm putting that back in my pocket, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen. But far better, I think, is to share sterling. Why can't we have the sharing of sterling, sharing the resources of the Bank of England? That is, we've built up the Bank of England. It's part of our asset. It holds all of the monetary assets of the United Kingdom. Indeed, the Bank of England holds 27% of the debt that George Osborne and Alistair Darling have managed to accumulate over these last 7-8 years. So it's part of the assets of the United Kingdom. It seems to me sensible, because our two economies are so aligned. England's our biggest export market. We're England's second biggest export market, that we continue to share a currency. And the problem with believability in what the unionist parties are saying is this. If they say we're going to seize the financial assets of the Bank of England, then they end up stuck with all of the financial liabilities of the country. And these financial liabilities are huge. They're worth, in terms of interest payments, £1,000 a year for everybody in this room. And one of the reasons why I don't believe George Osborne or Alistair Darling or Ed Balls is I know George Osborne quite well, and believe me, the last thing he would do in his life would be to arrive at a situation where he gave the people of Scotland £1,000 a year each. Just wouldn't happen. So, of course, there's going to be a sterling union, and of course, they're not going to try to seize the assets of the Bank of England because they'd end up stuck with all the liabilities. So there will be a currency union, which I think is in the best interest of people in Scotland. So people say, okay, if we have this currency union, then the Bank of England stays in control of interest rates, as it is at the present moment. See, it's not the Chancellor of the Exchequer who controls interest rates, it's the independent Bank of England. It has been since 1997, since Gordon Brown made it independent. But what we would control is control of our taxation and control of our revenue. Currently, Scotland controls 12% of our revenue. With the new powers for the Scottish Parliament, it's going to be 20%. With independence, it's 100%. And to me, 100% control of your taxation and revenue, that is independence, which is why I support it. And now for the colleges question, I'm going to turn to...
I'm very grateful for the ladies' questions. It's undoubtedly been a time of great change for the college sector, and certainly no one in this government would deny that that most certainly has not been without its challenges. But can I assure you that I'm very passionate about our college sector and the role of vocational education. Because if we are serious about our economy, we have to be serious about young people and their place in our economy. And the one thing that I've learnt over my time as a government minister having responsibility for a youth employment brief is that the countries in Europe with the lowest levels of youth unemployment have very well established vocational education and training systems. And as we move forward, our college sector has to be part of that. Now, as I said, it has been a time of great change. We've seen the regionalisation of colleges. That has meant that we now have colleges of scale that are far better equipped to respond to the local economy and to do more to prepare students, college students, for actually getting qualifications that are going to get them into work. And we can evidence that because we now have more students studying full-time qualifications and studying courses that give them recognised qualifications, all to which is going to assist young people in particular in their journeys towards and into work. And we've also had some success on those young people from the most disadvantaged communities, because we've seen the retention and completion rates of young people from the most difficult backgrounds and the most deprived communities actually continuing with their studies in the college sector. And if I can make one brief point about funding, in Scotland we spend a minimum of £522 million on the college sector every year. That will increase to £526 million. And we know there has been an economic crisis, an absolute assault on public finances. But today we are still spending more on our colleges, investing more in college education every year than any previous administration in Scotland is doing. So we are continuing to invest in the college sector. And if I can leave you with, I suppose, a quote, a paraphrase from Sir Ian Wood, of the Wood Group, and he led a very important independent commission called the Commission for Developing Scotland's Young Workforce. And essentially that was about how can we do better in the good economic times and the bad economic times to ensure that each and every one of our young people gets the best start to their working life. And he made a number of far-reaching conclusions and recommendations. But he also said that in Scotland we've got tremendous assets to build upon, namely Curriculum for Excellence, our modern apprenticeship programme, and our new reformed colleges. So we've got some platforms of reform to build upon and to make sure that each and every one of our young people get the best start to their working lives. And colleges are absolutely fundamental to that.
Okay, I'll start again with another quick Twitter question, this time from SLR Mag, asking how does the Scottish Government propose to allay the fears of businesses wary of the uncertainty in immediate post-Yes Scotland? I saw a gentleman in the middle there and a lady just there. Yep.
Evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Alec Tucker. I've got a question for the Health Minister and a question for Mr Salmond. So Mr Salmond spent a lot of time about NHS and poverty and all the rest of it. And there's obviously no quick fix when it regards to certain parts of the populace. But will the Health Minister promise that there'll be no more postcode lottery that we'll have in the rest of the present UK, and that some of the more expensive biological treatments which can treat cancers and other nasty diseases will be put at the point of delivery? So that's a question for the Health Minister. The other question I have for Mr Salmond, and I'm sure we've all been in this situation, I was in it for the last 3 times in the last year, where elderly patients, elderly relatives had no quality of life. Where do you stand on being more aggressive with regards to assisted suicide in an independent Scotland? And I would like to have, I don't want to hear anything about the House of Lords stuff, because that's going to be a wishy-washy affair. I would like to know what you think about assisted suicide. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jennifer. I'm an independent filmmaker, and what I want to know is sort of like, how do you feel that Scotland can progress in the world of filmmaking? This summer I was the second assistant director on a film called The Fairy Flag, which is touted as the biggest film in Scotland since Braveheart. Now, that's 20 years ago. Scotland is way too awesome to have such a lack of film. So basically, yeah, what can we do to make Scotland more prominent in the world of film, basically?
Okay, thank you. I like Scotland is way too awesome. That's 2 phrases I've got tonight. So I'm going to ask Fiona to pick up your question straight away. Then I'm going to turn to Alec for the health side of your question, sir. Then I'll answer the second part of it on assisted suicide, and then I'll answer SLR Mag from the Twittersphere.
Thanks very much. I also agree Scotland is too awesome, and we need to make sure that we can build on that fantastic asset. We've also just had the news yesterday that Outlander, which has been commissioned for a second series, filming out of Cumbernauld, fantastic, showcasing Scotland's wonderful scenery. So I know the tourism industry will be interested in that as well. But a very serious point about the capability that we have. We've got very talented people in the film sector, but too often, too many of them have to go elsewhere to earn a living and to share their skills. So we need to make sure there's more filmmaking in Scotland. That's why we're looking at film studio propositions just now. We do think that we need to build on what's already there. We've got one studio, as we said, in Cumbernauld, but we need more. But we also, as importantly as that, need to build up the sector, and in terms of advantages that independents can bring. We need to have our hands on the taxation system to allow us to have and incentivise filmmaking like they do in other countries. So even with the current proposals from the UK government, which we will match, Ireland will still be more competitive than Scotland in terms of tax breaks. But it's not just about tax breaks. I spoke to the Columbia, in Canada, a very strong filmmaking sector. They said it's the skills and talent. Now, we have got that in our art colleges. We've got that in new emerging filmmakers coming forward. But one of the best ways to help the sector is to have our own broadcasting corporation to increase the number of hours of production. Currently, Scotland only produces 2,000 hours of production for our independent filmmakers. In other countries, like in Denmark and Finland and Ireland, it's double that. And that would provide the opportunities and the platform to take us forward. But incentivising, providing more support facilities like a normal independent country means better films, more films being made here and showcasing this wonderful country of ours.
Can I answer the question on cancer? Can I just make 2 points? First of all, in terms of general progress in cancer, there's a revolution taking place, not just in Scotland, but globally in terms of our treatment of cancer. And many cancers, which even 5 or 10 years ago would have been a death sentence, today are becoming long-term conditions. Let me just give you one example of prostate cancer. 30 or 40 years ago, if you were diagnosed with prostate cancer, the chances are that from that diagnosis, you probably had only a few years to live. Now, if we get you early enough, 95% of people diagnosed with prostate cancer are under no threat to their life whatsoever. It is treated as a long-term condition, and as one consultant put it to me, these people will die with prostate cancer, but not of prostate cancer. And that's not just prostate cancer. If you saw the figures published yesterday, the substantial improvement in many other cancers like breast cancer, lung cancer even, where the survival rate is increasing enormously. And if you look at the progress scientifically over the next 5 or 10 years, I believe that the vast bulk of cancers that are still life-threatening today will become like prostate cancer, long-term conditions that will be treated over a 20, 30, 40-year period and will not be an immediate threat to a person's life. Now, the second part of the question, which was the specific one about the alleged postcode lottery, let me say part of my job is to make sure that everybody in Scotland gets the same quality, the same level of safety, and the same treatment, no matter where they live in Scotland. There has been a particular challenge in the north of Scotland, which includes Tayside, in terms of a shortage recently of oncologists. We are addressing that, and we are actively recruiting new oncologists into the north of Scotland. That covers Tayside, Grampian, the Three Island areas, as well as the Highlands. And I believe once that recruitment process is complete, we will be back to our full complement in the north of Scotland for oncologists, and any temporary problems we've had will be very quickly addressed. So my commitment to you is there will be no postcode lottery in Scotland. Our commitment is totally to participating in the global revolution in cancer, and I believe over the next 5 to 10 years you will see dramatic differences, dramatic improvements in the treatment of cancer, so that sitting 10 years from now, if we're sitting in this hall, I believe the vast bulk of cancers will no longer be life-threatening conditions.
Can I say to the gentleman about assisted suicide? I don't have to refer to a debate in the House of Lords. We had a real debate in the Scottish Parliament in the last session. And by a real debate, I mean a proposal, a bill, which, if it had been enacted, this was the bill proposed by the late Margaret MacDonald, would have become the law of Scotland. That bill will be coming back in a slightly amended form. I understand Patrick Harvey is taking it forward. Now, I didn't vote for Margaret's bill, but one thing I did do was ensure that it was a conscience vote. So there was no party whip on the bill, and people could vote according to their consciences. I believe that issues such as that should be judged. Nobody could have put the bill forward better than Margot, in my estimation. She did a fantastic job. She was suffering from Parkinson's herself. She did an amazing job in putting it forward. And the bill was conducted in a fantastically good spirit of argument and debate from all sides. It did the Parliament great credit. If I was trying to put my finger on it, and this is a personal view, it's not the view necessarily of any of my colleagues here, of the reason I didn't vote for it is that I have this doubt about changing the relationship between medical practitioners and their patients. And I think although any of us can have enormous sympathy for people in a humiliating, degrading position towards the end of their life, just trying to judge what is exactly the process by which somebody can opt for assisted suicide, and then putting a medical practitioner whose entire career, or her entire career, whether it be nurse or doctor or whatever, in a position where they're ending life as opposed to preserving life, does seem to me to change some of the fundamental relationships we have in society. But that doesn't mean that the arguments that Margaret put forward weren't strong and powerful, and of course they were all the more powerful because she was suffering from a condition which for many people can result in that sort of end-of-life humiliation. But I'll say one last thing, that Margot tragically died a few months ago. I met her a week before she died, and you know, although obviously physically dreadfully handicapped and infirm, mentally absolutely sharp as a tack with great absolute vitality. She was an extraordinary woman, and she put forward that bill in an extraordinary way, and no doubt it will be debated again, and it won't be debated, and the reason that incidentally I wasn't belittling the House of Lords debate, only to say it wasn't a bill, it was just a debate in a vacuum. There wasn't anything other than a discussion. It should be debated as another bill, and people will judge on their conscience whether to go ahead with it or not. But one thing I would say, that anybody who heard and saw and listened to that debate in the Scottish Parliament would have had no complaints whatsoever with the way that the subject was dealt with on both sides of the argument, and the fact that each and every individual MSP was allowed to come to a decision based on their conscience, not on a party line or a whip, but based on their conscience, as these things should be judged. Now, the question from SLR Mag, which was how do we counter the fear that people might have in, say, let's say, the business community. About 2.5 years ago, George Osborne made a television interview in Aberdeen. And he said, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he said, he was talking every day to businesses around the world who were very anxious about this Scottish independence. And he absolutely knew, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, it was deterring inward investment into Scotland. He then said he was doing his absolute best to persuade people it would be all right. But he was fighting an uphill battle, and he knew that this referendum thing was damaging, this was 2.5 years ago, inward investment into Scotland. In the last 2.5 years, we've had the record inward investment into Scotland since 1997. 2 years ago, we actually beat London in terms of inward investment, and we've had an outstanding performance. So either you believe that George Osborne was doing the most amazing job in reassuring people internationally, or you believe that the profile that Scotland has been getting over the last few years has been an advantage in securing inward investment. And I can tell you for an absolute fact, I've never found it as First Minister easier to promote Scotland internationally, like, for example, in Scotland Week, than I have over the last 2 years. Everybody and their auntie is talking about Scotland. And therefore you get over the most important thing of all, which is recognition. Once you get over the recognition barrier, you can start to tell people about the great advantages of this country, about our skilled workforce and the abilities we have. And that's why inward investment into Scotland has been rising. And then, of course, since the gambit of saying that inward investment would dry up didn't work out as the Unionist parties expected, they went on to jobs. And successive debates in the House of Commons, ministers, members of Parliament said they knew for a fact independence was costing jobs. That is, the prospect of a referendum was costing jobs. The only problem is that jobs in Scotland are now at an all-time high. We have more jobs in Scotland than any point in our history. Yes, we've still got high levels of unemployment because we're recovering from recession, but we recovered from the recession 1 quarter before the rest of the United Kingdom. Female employment in Scotland is now touching 70%, partly, I think, because of the expansion of childcare, which we intend, incidentally, to revolutionise in an independent Scotland, is allowing women to return to the workforce on a more equal basis than they've had in the past. So the scare stories about inward investment were proved wrong because we've got record inward investment. The scare stories about jobs were proved wrong because we've recovered from recession quicker than the rest of the United Kingdom, although it took a long time. I can't remember who was responsible for the financial crash, but his name will come to my mind very quickly if I think about it. So the scare stories about what will happen with independence are the same. There's a new organisation called Business for Scotland. There's 2,400 businesses, large and small, in Scotland. They're members of Business for Scotland. That's an organisation which articulates the case for economic control and independence for Scotland. Some of the greatest job creators in the history of Scotland, people like Jim McCall or Brian Souter, are supporters of independence. I went to an Asian business meeting last Friday night in Glasgow. Mr. Ramzan, who is the United Wholesalers, one of the biggest retailer wholesalers in the whole of Scotland, declared himself in favour of Scottish independence. Scare stories are exactly that, the sort of bogeymen that used to come out of the cupboard when we were small, or Count Dracula in one of these appalling Hammer horror films. That, you know, he looked really fearsome. If you dragged him into the sunlight, he disintegrated. And as we drag each and every one of these scare stories into the sunlight, so will they disintegrate as people realise the economic potential of this country is second to none.
Okay. Time is getting against us, so this will be the last round of questions. I think I've missed the very back section. There's a gentleman there and a second hand there, and then the lady right at the front here.
Hi, it's to the First Minister. Could you guarantee us that Scottish men and women will never die getting forced into a war that was on a pack of lies?
Hi, Carol Downey here. In the event of a yes vote on the 18th of September, I do believe that Scotland's new independent date will be March 2016. What I'd like to know is there any particular significance attached to this choice of date? And number two is there flexibility on this date if negotiations are still ongoing?
Okay, and then right at the front.
Hi, I'm Jen Muir. There's a lot of talk about funding for cancer, but I'm a carer for my mum who's got quite advanced dementia. My problem is about how it's judged whether we pay or whether the council pays. If you're talking about cancer, then the NHS pays. It doesn't matter what's happening. But if we were going to put her into a residential home today, everything would just be on her income. We'd have no problems whatsoever. But because we've been careful, my mum's never worked, not for a long, long time. We have ended up, if we put her in daycare, it's £80 a day we're going to have to pay. That's 1 week's attendance allowance gone in 1 day. That does not help our support to keep her at home. Can we not make this treated in the same way as cancer or mental health, where it comes from the centre, the policies, not from the council?
Okay. I know that Alec Newell, as Health Secretary, works on this, so I'm going to ask Alec to address your point, Jen, and then I'll address Carol's point about the 18-month period between the referendum and independence. And then I'll address the gentleman's question about wars, illegal wars, and Scottish soldiers.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Can I just make the general point that there are often disputes between the Health Board and the local authorities about who pays for what, and we're going to put an end to that nonsense because people are caught in the middle, and that's why we're integrating adult health and social care so that there will be one budget for both health and social care, and we no longer have this ping-pong between local authorities and health boards with the patient in the middle, and that starts in April next year. Now, in relation to your mum, if your mum is over of pension age, she is entitled to free personal care. Right. Right. Well, free personal care is available for people at home as well. I think the best way for me to deal with your mum's case is to talk to you immediately after this, find out exactly what the problem is, and then see if we can get it sorted. Because if your mum has got dementia, and particularly if she's over the age of pension age. She should be entitled to free personal care at home, and she should be entitled to other benefits as well, depending on her condition and depending, obviously, on her personal circumstances. So I think that's the best way to deal with this. But let me just say that free personal care is a fundamental that we intend to keep in an independent Scotland. And that's something else that's potentially under threat from the budget cuts that we will suffer if we do not vote yes on the 18th of September. Because both George Osborne and Ed Balls have said if they get elected next year, on top of the existing cuts, they will cut another £25 billion a year from public service budgets across the UK. Scotland's share of those cuts will be just over £2 billion a year. And therefore, with that level of cuts, many of the services that we are providing today could come under real threat. Whereas, as John said, we've got the money in Scotland to pay for these services, and I give you a guarantee, if we get independence, free personal care will continue in an independent Scotland.
Can I answer Carol's point? Because you've put forward a very important point that I should maybe have mentioned earlier, that we're having the referendum on the 18th September, but Scotland does not become independent on the 19th September. There's an 18-month period for negotiation. Negotiations with Westminster, negotiations with the European Union, and negotiations to make Scotland an independent country. 18 months is long enough. It's long enough because actually 18 months is the average time between countries who've had referendum on independence and becoming independent. And Scotland, compared to the vast majority of these countries which have gone through a referendum process, is in an amazingly good position to become an independent country. Why? Because we have a parliament, we have a system of proportional representation, we have a separation of powers between the judiciary and the parliament, we have our own legal system. We already control 60% of public spending in Scotland. We already have the whole government apparatus. Therefore, to transfer from being a devolved parliament to an independent parliament relative to what other countries have gone through as establishing themselves as independent countries, we're in a better position than just about anybody. 18 months, how do I know 18 months will be enough for, let's say, the European Union? Well, the UK government a couple of years ago employed a very prominent international lawyer called James Crawford. And they actually paid him to give them an opinion to suit them in a number of aspects. But one thing, because he's an honest man, he was asked on BBC Radio 4, what's the timetable for all of this? And he replied, well, the Scottish Government says 18 months, and that seems to me realistic. So listen, it's one thing your lawyer saying something. If the other guy's lawyer says it, then you know that 18 months is a perfectly realistic timetable in terms of doing what we've got to do. Why should we do it in that 18 months? Well, in the spring of 2016 is the next Scottish elections. And I think it's really important that we have the independence settlement along the lines put forward in the white paper, so that the first thing that people do once Scotland becomes an independent country is to choose their government. I mean, the whole point about this, I mean, I sometimes look at our opponents and they say, this is a kind of Alex Salmond project, or it's the SNP's vanity project. In essence, this has got nothing to do with Alex Salmond or the SNP. If somebody in this audience could guarantee me, if I had, the Delphic Oracle or a soothsayer, the Brahms seer was sitting in this audience, the Brahms seer said to me, listen, you retire from politics tomorrow, and I guarantee you Scotland will be an independent country in the spring of 2016, I would shake hands on that right away. Absolutely. If somebody said to me, and I love the SNP, I've been in the SNP for donkey's years, and I just think it's a wonderful political organisation. It has its faults, believe me, but basically it's got a beating heart as a political party. It believes in a principle, the principle of Scottish independence. It has compassion at its heart as a political organisation. I don't think you can ask for much more than that. But listen, if the Brahms seer said to me, and the other cost of getting independence is the SNP has to be abolished, then I would agree to that as well. Because this is about the people of Scotland, for the first time in democratic history, having the ability to determine the government of their choice. It's the choice of the people of Scotland that's the important thing. Not which political party or which First Minister, it's the choice of the people of Scotland. So that never again will be in the position which for more than my inveigling myself into my 50s, half of my life, shall we get a government we didn't vote for, where there's more pandas in the zoo than are Tory MPs in Scotland, but they're the government. This is the whole point, is to get a government of our choice, because it's based on the belief, which is true for Scotland and I think true for any country anywhere, that the best people to choose to run this country are the people who live and work in the country. Nobody will make better decisions about our future than we ourselves. So that's what I would say to the Bram Seer if I was given that option tonight. But see, one of the things we'll be able to choose to address the gentleman's point lastly is we'll choose whether to participate in conflict or not. We'll be able to choose whether it's right and proper, and sometimes it will be right and proper, incidentally, to send our young men and women into danger. And I cannot conceive that any Scottish government, led by any political party, ever likely to get the support of the Scottish people, would ever have entered into the illegal conflict in Iraq. It would not have happened. My lady wife up in Stricken used to keep ducks, Muscovy ducks, and she called one of her Muscovies Dominic, after Dominic de Villepin, the French Foreign Secretary, who denounced the attempt to illegally invade Iraq at the United Nations Security Council meeting. If you remember, for those of us who are old enough, the one that was televised back in 2003, when he said France is an old nation, and as an old nation we can decide, and we know a bit about conflict, probably too much about conflict, and spoke out against it. So my wife called one of our Muscovy ducks Dominic. She was so impressed. But I suppose it's the only time that she's ever known who the French Foreign Secretary was. But the important thing is this, that we'd have our choice as to what's right and what's wrong. And as we look at the total disaster unfolding in Iraq at the present moment, every single one of the politicians who decided to ignore the Security Council, to ignore the legitimacy of international law, who said it was right to gung-ho, to bringe into Iraq, and then didn't even have the decency to think through the consequences or plan for the consequences. Every single life that's been lost, every single one, is the unmistakable responsibility of these people who led us into that illegal conflict, the consequences of which we are seeing today and the consequences of which we'll see for a generation to come. So I think as we see what's happening to the minorities in Iraq, then the right and proper thing to do is for us to go back to the United Nations to atone for what didn't happen in 2003 and to ask for support for the Security Council for what should be done, and I think things should be done, in terms of protecting, for example, the Kurd, the Sharia in the north of Iraq, for protecting minorities, but do it on the basis of international law. Because if you don't do it on the basis of international law, then the consequences will haunt this world forever. And those who told us that that sort of thing could just be swept aside because they knew best have been proven wrong. And one of the greatest things about Scottish independence, at least we'll have our opportunity to decide whether or not our young men and women should go into a conflict, and they will never, if I've got anything to do with it, be sent into an illegal one.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for raising such interesting and diverse subjects. I hope you found this evening as interesting and informative as I have. Can I ask you all to remain seated while the Cabinet leaves the stage and moves across to the Church Hall, and you'll be able to invite you all to join us there for a cup of tea, and we can continue the discussions there with individual Cabinet Ministers. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, can I, on behalf of the First Minister, thank you all for coming along and for your questions.